Okay, so we're back for our Parsha Insights, but it's going to be a little bit of a different tack this time because we are in Pesach mode. And just a note of housekeeping is that we're not going to be meeting for the next 2 weeks because next week is Erev Pesach, and I think everybody is going to be furiously busy with Pesach prep, and then on Chol HaMoed Pesach, we'll take a break. We'll be back the week after Pesach to resume with our cycle of Parshas. And today we're going to look at Midrashim connected to the Passover Haggadah. That's our objective, and it's a bit of a redundancy because the Haggadah itself is a form of Midrash, is a form of rabbinic writing and commentary on the Torah. But we'll jump right in. We'll take a look, and we're going to look at one of the sections which is in the Midrashic style in the Haggadah. There are certain things that are kind of pretty far removed from the verses, but the verses are there. You can find them, whether it's the 4 sons or the 4 questions. There's always something to connect back to the Torah text, but there's actually a section of the Haggadah which takes apart psukim and gives us midrashic interpretation of the psukim, and that's what we're going to be looking at right now. So here we go. We're jumping right in. This happens right after we raise our glasses and say, Vehi sha'amda lavotenu, this is what stood for our ancestors, every generation, and so on and so forth. And then as if almost to give an example or to demonstrate that this has been the case throughout history, we go right into anti-Semitism, to where in our history they stood up against us and tried to destroy us. So here we go. Tzei ulamad. I feel like at the Seder we should go around and everyone takes turns reading a paragraph, but it's okay. Tzei ulamad. Go and learn. Ma bikesh Lavan harami la'asot liYaakov Avinu. What Lavan the Aramean? What does Aramean mean? Aramean means literally he comes from Aram, which is where our ancestors were from. There, I believe, 2 places mentioned that are connected. One is Aram Naharaim and the other is Padan Aram. Both, some commentators say they're the same place. Abraham was from there. Isaac and Jacob and 11 of the tribes are all born there. This is where Yaakov is sent to where he goes to find a wife, because this is family, this is mishpacha. Lavan, the son of Betuel, right? These are all familiar names. This is all part of the Abrahamic line, and this is where they come from. And so Lavan is the Aramean, Arami. But there are also some commentators, this is getting a bit perhaps Hasidic in the approach, who point out that from this word Arami, Aramean, we also have, if you re-scramble the letters, you come out with the word Ramai, Resh Mem Aleph Yud, Ramai, which means trickster. Right, so Lavan the trickster. That's why he's being called the Arami, is because he has that character of being devious, of being deceptive. So this is, go look what Lavan tried to do to Yaakov. Sheparo lo gazar ala zacharim. Paro only wanted to kill the males. Lavan bikesh la'akor et hakol. But Lavan wanted to uproot the entirety of the people. Shene'amar, as it says. And here's the verse that we're going to be focusing on. Arami oved avi. An Aramean was destroying my father. Vayered Mitzrayma. And he went down, and Jacob went down to Egypt. Vayagar sham bimtei ma'at. And he resided there with a small number. Vayihisham lagoy gadol atzum v'rav. And he became a great, powerful nation, a numerous nation there, right? So this is the story of our people, is that Lavan tried to destroy us. Lavan didn't want us to succeed. Yaakov ran away, dwelled in Egypt, and became a great nation. That's the verse from Deuteronomy 26:5. And that verse then, and this is all part of the Haggadah. This is a midrash within the Haggadah. And now the Haggadah is going to take apart this verse clause by clause by clause. And we're going to really focus on 2 things right here. One is going to be Tzei ulamad, go and learn. And another is going to be the very last part of the interpretation, which is going to be how this midrash interprets the word varav, numerous. How it interprets the word numerous, okay? So, but we'll run through because it's familiar, it's Passover prep. So we're going to pick it up Vayered Mitzrayma. So firstly, what happened to this part of the verse? Arami Oved Avi. We've already treated it. This midrash right here, these first lines, are an interpretation of Arami Oved Avi. An Aramean tried to destroy my father. Okay? Arami, an Aramean, Oved, sought to destroy. Avi, my father. Very simple, right? Not so simple. We'll get back to it in a moment. But that's how the Midrash is understanding these words. And he went down to Egypt. What do you mean he went down to Egypt? Anus al pi hadibor, which means forced by the word. God said to Abraham, you're going to go down to Egypt. Jacob has no choice. Jacob has to go down to Egypt. This is part of the prophecy. This is part of what God had promised Abraham. He's forced. Anus vayagar sham, and it continues that he resided there. That that Jacob only wanted to go down. He didn't go down to settle, but rather to reside. His initial intention was just to ride out the famine in Egypt, right? And that's what the verse says, right? This is the explicit purpose of his traveling to Egypt. Okay, so that's the first part of the verse. He went down to Egypt and he dwelled there, meaning he went down because he had to. And he dwelled there, but he didn't reside there. He didn't go to live, even though he stayed for 210 years, didn't go to live. Bimtei ma'at, he went down in small numbers. Kamash and Amar, and here's your proof text, that with 70 souls did your ancestors go down to Egypt. Okay, that's the proof text, that they went down in very small numbers. Vayehi sham legoy, they became a nation. Malamed shahayu Yisrael mitsuyanim sham, they became, the translation, distinguishable there. They became noteworthy. They became not just a cluster of people, but they became a nation. There's something significant about that. Gadol atzum, right? We're back here in the verse. Gadol, which means great. Atzum, which means powerful. Gadol atzum, kamash and emar, as it says, and the children of Israel multiplied and swarmed and grew numerous and strong, most exceedingly, and the land became full of them. Okay, so far fairly straightforward, and now we come to this last word, varav. Rav, know what that word comes from, or it's connected to another common Hebrew word?
Rabim, many.
Rabim, plural, excellent. Also the word harbe.
Oh yeah.
Same thing.
Harbe is also many. How much do you have? Harbe, a lot. So varav, it's all connected to that, to being great. A rov, you know what a rov is in Hebrew? Same word. Rov is a majority.
Many.
It's a majority. Do you have a rov? Do you have a majority of votes? Okay. Varav. So what does it mean, numerous? Kimash Amar, as it says, Rivava ketsemech hasadeh netaticha. So now we're quoting the verse in Ezekiel. I have given you to be numerous as the vegetation of the field, and you increased and grew and became highly ornamented. Your breasts were set and your hair grew, but you were naked and barren. One of the very strange verses in the Haggadah, which very, very unique verses in the Haggadah. And so we're going to look at this for a moment as to what this interpretation is doing here, because I'll tell you, when the Torah interpreted that they were few, or when the Midrash interpreted that they were few, what was the proof? The proof was
70.
Was a verse from the Torah which said 70. Very straightforward, very in the box, right? If you want to know any of these things, right? Do you want to know why, again, okay, let's go through it again. Went down to Egypt. How do we know the interpretation? Because there's a verse, because we know what happened with Abraham, very in the box. How do we know that they went down only to dwell and not to settle? Because there's a verse that tells me, very in the box answer. How do we know that they were few? Because the verse tells me that they were few. How do I know, okay, this is a different one, that they became a nation? That's more of a logical interpretation. How do we know that they became great and mighty? Because there's a verse that tells me. It's an in the box answer. And then suddenly for this, how do we know they became plentiful? Varav, numerous. Suddenly you're throwing this verse about me about vegetation and grass? Where is this coming from? Okay, so before we get to that, we're going to do a quick treatment of this phrase, say ulamad, go and learn. Go and learn. It's a very, very interesting phrase. For many years, our Tuesday night learning program had the phrase, Tashma, come and learn. It's from the Talmud, Tashma, come and learn. But here, go and learn. What do you mean go and learn? What is that supposed to why don't you just tell me? Tell me go and learn. The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, very famous story about a Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. And Shammai pushes...
You have to tell Abby you're using her text. Abby
yeah?
used their text on Monday, yeah.
Okay,
A whole bunch
fantastic.
of them.
Great. Where do you think I stole this from? So,
Abby.
so convert me on the condition, teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. So Shammai pushes him away. Okay, comes before Hillel. Hillel converts him and says to him, that which is hateful to you, don't do to another. That's the entire Torah. The rest is interpretation. Go study. That's what Hillel says. Those same words. Go study. Granted, it's in Aramaic. Zil Gamor. But you know how to say Zil Gamor in Hebrew?
Seilmad.
Seilmad. The exact same thing. Go study. And the Baruch She'amar of Baruch Halevi Epstein, in his commentary on the Haggadah, points out this connection. And he says, go out and learn what Lavan Aramean sought to do to Jacob, our forefather. What does the expression go out and learn mean? It's a way of saying there's a great deal to say about this particular matter, but that's not the time or the place to dwell on the topic. That's what Hillel says, basically, to the guy. You want to learn the Torah? Go and learn it. As for now, I'm going to teach you one core lesson. This expression is similar to the one in the well-known story of the Hillel and the Gentile who wants to be taught the whole Torah. Hillel answers, what's hateful to you, don't do to others. The rest is commentary. Go out and learn. Hillel tells the Gentile questioner, listen, there's a lot to say about this matter. I can teach you the basic idea now, but you'll have to learn the rest on your own. And so his explanation, and this is, I think, a nice nugget for the Haggadah, is that we're not going to get through this whole story. V'hi sha'amda lavotenu. In every generation, you want an example? Look at Lavan. This is not the entirety of the story. Say ulamad, go and learn. You could go out and learn, and you could spend your whole life studying this, and you wouldn't have a comprehensive approach to this entire subject matter. But as for now, here's Lavan, here's the core, here's what it's all about. The rest, say ulamad, or zil gamor, as the Talmud says. I thought this was a very nice insight. Just interpretation of those words, go and study, tells you there's a lot to know about this subject. I'm not teaching you all of it right now, but I'm going to give you at least the basics right now, and the rest is up to you to figure out. The verse, okay, any questions before we go back to this concept, to the Midrash on Varav, talking to me about, I've given you to be numerous as the vegetation of the field. Any comments on this or questions? Okay, so just the verse in Exodus, it's important to point this out, that the beginning of Exodus and the story of what happens after the children of Israel grow and they become numerous, Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim, a new king arises over Egypt, Asher lo yadat Yosef, who didn't know Joseph. Did he really not know Joseph? So the Midrashim argue about this. Was it the same guy and he didn't know Joseph? Was it a new guy? That seems to be what it's saying. Okay, a new king doesn't know Joseph, or it's the same king who forgot Joseph. The Midrashim argue about what exactly is happening. Vayomer el amo, but to incite the people against the Jews, he says, Hine am b'nei Yisrael, look at the children of Israel, Rav va'atzum mimenu. They are too numerous for us, but look at what he says, Rav. What does Rav mean? Many, numerous. Atzum is mighty. Which comes first? So one is quantity, numerous. The other is quality, is mighty. Which comes first, quantity or quality? Quantity. Rav, numerous, va'atzum, mighty, quantity before quality. That's how the Torah typically describes these two characteristics. They are too numerous and they are too mighty. But look at the way the Haggadah says it. Look at the way the verse says it. They are atzum varav. They are mighty and numerous. It's flipped, it's reversed. Quality before quantity. So what's really happening here? So we're going to have to interpret this idea of numerous in a different way other than just quantity. And we have this fascinating midrash, an absolutely fascinating midrash from the commentary Marbeh L'Saper, which talks to us about this idea of being numerous. What does that mean? He says that they were great. The author of the Haggadah was curious why the word Rav comes after the word Atzum, why great comes after mighty, because otherwise we say mighty, great and mighty. We don't say mighty and great, and there's two different examples of that. Okay, we've established that question. The word Rav here, so he's now reinterpreting the word Rav to not only mean numerous in the classic sense of just numbers. So Rav is an allusion to the verse, I let you grow like the plants of the field. Just to look at the Hebrew of that verse for a moment. The Hebrew of the verse is rivava. The word Rav comes from rivava. Rivava is numerous, right? Rav, rivava, it's the same word, numerous. So he's okay, we're connected to let you grow like the plants of the field. And look at the explanation from the Talmud that he quotes in the name of Rabbi Avira, who says, that the Israelites, why the Israelites left Egypt? Because of the women. As a reward for the righteous women who lived in that generation, the Israelites were delivered from Egypt. When they went to draw water, the Holy One, blessed He, arranged that small fish should enter their pitchers, which they drew up half full of water, half full of fish, and then 2 pots on the fire, one for hot water, the other for the fish, which they carried to their husbands in the field and washed, anointed, fed, gave them to drink, and had intercourse with them among the sheepfolds. I mean, basically the story, we won't focus on this part of the Midrash, but basically the story as to how they encouraged, how this slave people managed to have children, how they managed both logistically and also from the sense of desire, how they managed in their places of slavery. And what the Talmud is giving in this midrash, the Talmud is giving credit to the women for initiating all, for going out and getting the food and making sure their husbands weren't hungry, and going out into the fields and in many ways seducing them in the fields or encouraging them to engage in intercourse and to procreate. And after the women had conceived, the midrash continues, after the women had conceived, they returned to their homes, and when the time of childbirth arrived, they went and delivered in the field beneath the apple tree. And the Holy One, so what do? It's dangerous. It's dangerous to give birth away from civilization in the fields. The Holy One sent down someone from the high heavens, so assuming angels, as the commentators say, who washed and straightened the limbs of the babes in the same manner that a midwife straightens the limbs of a child. This was part of the ancient practice of midwifery, was what they call, I'm blanking on the Hebrew phrase, but chilutz atzamot, what they called strengthening the limbs of the child. That was seen as something necessary to do immediately upon birth, was to stretch out the limbs, strengthen the limbs. And he also provided for them 2 cakes, one of oil, one of honey. And when the Egyptians noticed them, they went to kill them, the babies. They went to kill the babies. But a miracle occurred on their behalf so that they were swallowed in the ground. And once the Egyptians saw that the babies were swallowed into the ground, but not in a way of burial, in a way of protection. But when the Egyptians saw that, they said, oh, we still want to kill these babies. So they brought plows and they brought oxen and they plowed over them, trying to kill the babies, the subterranean babies. After they had departed, but somehow they survived, and the babies broke through the earth and came forth like herbage of the field. And they said, I caused thee to multiply like plants of the field, right? Isn't this an amazing interpretation of the Haggadah? The Haggadah says you're going to be numerous like the grass in the fields, like the vegetables in the fields. And the Talmud says, you know what happened? The babies in Egypt, they grew like vegetables. They were underground after their parents had birthed them.
Okay.
They were underground and they came forth just like vegetables. They grew from the ground. Hold on, we'll get to this, to the whole point of what I want to finish the Talmud, and then Peter, I won't guess what you're going to say, but I can't wait to hear what you're going to say. I caused thee, and so the proof text, I caused thee to multiply like plants of the field. How do you read that word like? Is it a simile, or is it actually you were plants of the field and you multiplied just as plants of the field grow, so too you grew, O children of Israel. But look what happens even more, even beyond this, that these babes have grown up, they came in flocks to their homes, thou just increased and waxed great and come with ornaments. Ornaments can be read as flocks, not ornaments, but flocks, the Hebrew. And the time the Holy One, blessed be he, revealed himself by the Red Sea, they recognized him first. These babies who had been protected by God and by the angels were the ones who said, Ze Eli v'anve'u, this is my God and I will exalt. They were the ones who recognized God's presence first because they had been saved. They had been saved by God. Let me just skip ahead to this. They wore their ornaments. He continues that they were easily recognizable to their parents, as we have said above, because their parents gave birth. They gave them ornaments. They were swallowed up by the earth. How do you know which child in an era before the hospital bracelets, those little ankle bracelets that they put on newborns? So they had their own ornaments that they were using in Egypt. And the expression mighty, everyone immediately knew that these children were not the offspring of Egyptian women. The expression mighty and great is a reference. They not only increased in number, but they were numerous in their numbers, but they were born like the plants of the field and protected by God. So that's basically the interpretation of the Marbel Saper based on the Midrash of why we are treating the Haggadah, when the Haggadah says that they were numerous, why suddenly we find ourselves in a verse in Ezekiel talking about grass. It says, oh, this is an allusion to the Midrashic tradition, that they were like grass, that's how babies grew. Jewish babies grew in Egypt after they were birthed by their mothers. They grew from the ground. Peter.
Well, with respect, it strains credibility. So my question is, why do we feel we need to express this issue of becoming numerous through a metaphor, which is frankly a miracle, a begazant, fair enough. But after we get over the idea that the miracle is covering something which is largely not credible, the question really is, why did the wisdom literature feel that they had to explain it using this metaphor?
Excellent question. I think you're pointing, I imagine you're not the only one around
I'm sure I'm not.
around the Zoom table who is struggling with the idea of children being placed underground, surviving the Egyptian plows, and suddenly emerging with ornaments intact and being returned to their families miraculously and having an encounter with God in their first moments with this protection. It's a fantastic story. It's fantastical. It's pretty hard to believe. So what's the bigger point? That's your question, is what's So firstly, one thing which is very midrashic in nature is understanding that we are backed into a corner to force an interpretation because of literary elements. Because, as we explained before, the word order begs me to offer an interpretation that's less obvious. That's just point number one. Usually it says Rav va'atzum. Here it says Atzum v'Rav, mighty and numerous. So I have to interpret that word numerous a little bit differently. And the way that this midrash is choosing to interpret it is numerous has not to do with the number in which they grew, but how they grew, how they emerged. It's an allusion to this concept of vegetation and brings me into a whole different idea as to the growth process and the survival process of these children. All because we started with the word order, with a question about word order, which is
also because of the verse from Ezekiel, because the Ezekiel verse has the plants in it.
Exactly. But the only reason we looked at Ezekiel was because if it had said Rav va'atzum, I wouldn't have looked at Ezekiel, because that's the normal way that the Torah speaks. The minute the Torah changed its word order, suddenly it told me that that there's something I need to do. Anyway. There's a lot to that. The second aspect of the question is, okay, once I'm forced into finding another interpretation, why this interpretation? Why are you taking me out into the fields with the grass? And why not stick to something a bit more obvious and logical and consistent with the natural world? That's an excellent question. Let me invite you. We're going to look together at a modern treatment of this idea. And if it resonates, it resonates. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But basically, it says, you know what? Once you're telling me that the children of Israel were like grass, maybe there's something to learn from grass that's relevant to me. Maybe there's something about this midrash which is going to give me strength or teach me a lesson that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'll invite us to do that. And I'm not going to, I won't stand here and defend and talk to you about, there's a scientific opinion that says that if one puts a child underground that it grows, or it's all an allusion to this or that. No, there's nothing there. I'm not going to try to defend it or force a defense in that way. I will agree with you and say, yes, when I read this, I have difficulty imagining that this ever happened. I also have difficulty, imagining in a natural way that so much else happened as described in the book of Exodus. And yet I'm willing to make a leap of faith in certain things, but in other things, perhaps less so, but that's for another time. So
Rabbi, before you go to the other thing,
Yeah.
Did you see anything in other midrashim, not to do with Pesach? This is the first time I've confronted something that is so far-fetched in all these years. It's, forget about credulity. I mean, I had a smile on my face when we first started reading it, but it's like, have you ever confronted anything in midrash that was this extreme in terms of
yeah, sure. I mean, there are many different examples. I'm just trying to think of one example, but there are midrashim that talk about how many babies the mothers had in Egypt, right?
Oh yeah.
How many every pregnancy bore how many children? Right? You're talking about hundreds and thousands of children per human pregnancy that the midrashim talk about. I mean, there's example after example. Many of the midrashim, they go out there. They exist in this sphere of disbelief, and whether you're supposed to bring that in and say with perfect faith that yes, women reproduced like I don't know, seahorses or whatever it is in Egypt, whatever they spit out children, child after child after child. I don't know, but yeah, there's some.
It's interesting that in the same section, there's a description of ankle bracelets to identify children, which is perfectly feasible, perfectly logical, makes sense. So there's this mixture of fantastic metaphors and almost medically observable facts.
I think that's a fantastic. There's a little dose of realism in there to throw you off a little bit. Meaning, God, once you're already bringing these children underground, saving them, and then having them grow up, couldn't you also just give them a birthmark, which would make them recognizable? Couldn't you also figure out some other way that we don't have to make these ankle bracelets with matching names? And I mean, couldn't you do that? Yeah. So you're right. The miracle is paired with a little dose of realism. Okay, let's go back to let me find it. Okay, there we go. Ben Sira. So the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah. Ben Sira said, this is going to lead us to a contemporary interpretation. Ben Sira said, God brings forth spices from the earth. This is quoting from the book of Ben Sira, the wisdom of Ben Sira, which is a non-canonical work. It's not part of Tanakh, but it is considered a book of wisdom that's quoted in the Talmud. God brings forth the spices from the earth. With them, the healer heals the ailments, and with them, the perfumer perfumes the perfumes.
Rabbi, I'd like to say that here we get something completely different, and it's almost poetic. It doesn't strain credibility. And the Hebrew particularly is a play on words. But I think one letter is missing, maybe two. Elohai hala samim, but that could be short for besamim. And then harofe merape et hamarkeh, but that could be hamachala. I don't know.
Yeah.
And it keeps on playing on these words, mirkachat, harokeach, mirkachat et hamirakachat.
Yeah, it's a
So
beautiful.
in Hebrew, it's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's beautiful alliteration happening here. So Eloha, God, He'elah samim min haaretz. So spices, or we would refer to it as drugs in modern Hebrew, but spices could be bisamim or samim. They're both valid forms of referring to that. Bahem harofe merape et hamaka. The makah is the wound.
The wound.
Wound.
Could it also be machala?
That would be more of an illness. Here,
Okay.
makah is also the same word as used for a plague.
Right. Okay.
So
Right.
Uvahem harokeach merakeach et hamirkachat. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tongue twister, but exactly, the perfumer or rokeach could be a pharmacist or a perfumer. Merakeach et hamirkachat. So here the second teaching, Amar Rabbi Simon, Ein lecha kol, is a beautiful teaching. Ein lecha kol esev ve'esev she'ein lo mazal barakia shemakeh oto ve'omer lo gedal. There isn't a single herb or spice that doesn't have a constellation in the firmaments that smacks it and tells it to grow. Every blade of grass has a muzzle. Every blade of grass has something that's paying attention to it, has some piece of the divine attention. Every blade of grass. So look at so taking all of these sources into consideration. There's a new Haggadah, Rav Moshe Weinberger's Haggadah, Moshe Weinberger's interpretation of Haggadah. It's called Belibat Esh, Heart of Fire, in the heart of the fire. It's a beautiful interpretation, beautiful Haggadah. And look at what he says. Hashem made us numerous. This is comment on the section we're looking at, enabling us to thrive like the brush of the fields. The Apter Rebbe, Rav Avraham Yoshua Heschel, from the town of Apt in modern Poland, Opatov. He speaks about two types of natural opposing forces that do battle to exert their influence on us. One is the gravitational pull, which drags us down towards destruction, towards Gehenna. Its opposite is the growing and blossoming of plant life, which pushes higher and higher out of the ground despite cold and difficult conditions. So he sets up these two natural pulls. There's growth and there's gravity. One pulls up, one pushes up, one pulls down. How do we push ourselves to grow despite the forces pulling us down? When difficulties occur, we realize we're like blades of grass. Each of us has an angel hitting us and saying, Gadal, grow. And when we go through difficulties, instead of saying Hashem hates me, we must recognize that Hashem is hitting us on the head and saying, Gadal, grow. I am doing this in order for you to grow. In Fate and Destiny, the Rav Soloveitchik describes two types of Jews, one of fate and one of destiny. There's a Jew of fate who's always asking, why did this happen to me? That's the gravity. That's the pull down. In contrast, there's a Jew of destiny. Instead of asking why, he inquires, what does God want from me in this situation? How can I grow from this experience? That's an example of a modern interpretation on this midrash, on the concept of growth. The word Rav is there to bring me into the mindset of growth. Like blades of grass, we have to grow in these difficult situations, which I thought was a very beautiful, beautiful interpretation. Even if it doesn't answer your question directly, but it shows a different angle to, one angle was the Marbella Saper Haggadah, which said the reason we're talking about grass is because there's a tradition that the children of Israel grew like grass. Rav Moshe Weinberger in his Haggadah says the reason we talk about grass there in numerous is to tell us that we have to push ourselves to grow, in that it's easy to be numerous and to fall flat. You can be part of a great people, but be dragged down by fate. The destiny aspect, the aspect of taking control, of understanding that God sometimes flicks us and says, grow, 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 that we have to be alert to that possibility. And that we learn from the traditions associated with blades of grass in our tradition. In the 2 minutes that we have left, I just want to give a little bit of context and show the power of midrash. To go back to the beginning, remember this whole conversation is a midrash, which takes a verse and says, they have stood against us in every generation. What was the verse? The verse, and now we're going to look at the verse in its context in the book of Deuteronomy. The verse, it talks about the first fruits and a declaration that the Jew would make with the first fruits. And the Jew would say, right, God, I've entered the land, and the priest, you shall make the following declaration. You say these words, Arami Oved Avi, which means what? An Aramean sought to destroy my father. I didn't translate it on purpose because we're going to look at it in a second. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. Very straightforward. This is what the Haggadah teaches me, right? Exactly. An Aramean. And look at what Rashi says. Rashi says, Assyrian, that's a bad translation, Aramean destroyed my father. He mentioned the loving, right? An Aramean destroyed my father. We don't need to look any further than that. Very consistent with the way we've been looking at it. But let's look at these words again for a moment. I'm going to zoom in as much as I can. Okay. Arami Oved Avi. What's Arami? Aramean. Who's an Aramean?
Lavan.
Lavan. Who else?
Avram.
Avram. Who else? Isaac. Yitzchak. Who else? Jacob. So why am I assuming that this means Lavan? Let's entertain for a moment that, because in Hebrew, keep in mind, there's no word order. This is not subject, verb, object. In Hebrew, it could all be mixed up. There's no concept of word order here. So we have the Aramean. So we think it was Lavan who destroyed my father or sought to destroy my father, but maybe this is Jacob. And maybe Oved. What does Oved mean? So there are a number of things it could mean. It could mean destroy. It could also mean wander. It can also mean to meander. And Avi is my father. So these same three words, which can mean Lavan, the Aramean, sought to destroy my father, can also mean my father was a wandering Aramean. Right? Same three words, meaning two very different things. And we said, Rashi looks at this and says, oh, Lavan, the Aramean, sought to destroy my father. That's what Rashi says. But look at some of the other commentators. Arami, my father Jacob, who was for a while a wandering lost person without a home of his own, was not at the time able to establish a nation deserving or fit to inherit this land. He interprets it entirely differently. The word oved means to be lost. It could mean to cause somebody else to lose, to destroy, but it could also mean to be lost yourself. So Lavan, from the Hebrew word like an aveda. An aveda is the opposite of a metzia. An aveda is something you lose, a metzia is something you find. So an aveda, to lose. And look at what the Chizkuni says. My father was a wandering Aramean. It's abbreviated. It should have said, my Yaakov, my forefather, was a wandering Aramean, right? It should have said, Yaakov Avi, Arami Oved. That's what it should have said. While he was serving Lavan and Aram, he was no better than a wandering Aramean. He had no house or land of his own. He was not even a resident in that country.
Unbelievable.
Right? This is quite dramatic. We have two verses. If you read it one way, what does it talk about? It talks about my father, my ancestors' experiences as being wandering, as having to establish themselves. If you read it another way, it's a story of anti-Semitism, of Lavan hating my father. Which way do you choose to read it? And so going back to the beginning, to the Haggadah has a very clear approach. The Haggadah chooses to read this as Lavan sought to destroy Yaakov. That's a midrash in and of itself. You know, we've probably read this year after year, time after time, and taken it for granted. Yeah, the verse in Deuteronomy, look, it says it right here, Deuteronomy 26:5, that Lavan tried to destroy my father. But keep in mind that the majority of commentators actually see this verse as saying something very different, that my father Jacob was a wandering Aramean. Who was the Aramean? Well, either was Lavan or Jacob. Choose how you want to read it. But a midrash is that interpretation. The midrash is taking a side and saying there's a different way of reading it, which tells a whole different story. And the whole placement of this in the Haggadah is all based on Vehi She'amda. This is what has stood. They've stood up against us in every generation. An Aramean was destroying my father. But that's midrash. That's choosing an interpretation, running with it, and seeing where it takes us in terms of meaning. So we've looked at this verse. We've gone out into the fields. We've seen some incredible things happening to Jewish babies and their survival. We've seen miracles. We've also we've grappled with some doubt in terms of those miracles. We've come away with some interesting lessons about growth and gravity. And at the end of the day, I think we've spent a good time with Midrash and the role of Midrash in the Passover Haggadah. Any comments or questions as we've reached our time? But anything anyone would like to offer before we say goodbye?
Yes, Rabbi. Thank you very, very much. We're all taken by the preamble to the phrase, and we don't really analyze it. So this is really terrific. I've learned a lot and something to bring to our Seder. Thank you. And Chag Kasher B'Sameach.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, and wishing everyone as well a Shabbat Shalom, a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and we'll hope to
How long ago?
see you
How long
soon.
ago did you read this other variant in terms of the wandering that Avida Veda, Aramia Veda V? How long ago did you come upon this one?
How long ago did I come upon this one? I would say there are two answers to that question. One is years and years ago. This is something that certainly is in my mind when I read this. When did I remember it and think about it for these purposes? At about 11:30 last night.
Oh, okay.
I really the sources, and it's an excellent question. It really began with that Haggadah of Rav Moshe Weinberger, of looking
Okay.
at the grass differently. And then I took a step back and said, okay, let me do some research on that section of the Haggadah, Say Ulamad. And then I came across a comment which I thought was great about Say Ulamad, which connected it to the story of Hillel, go out and learn, and that these two words, that this phrase is a code for there's a lot more to know about this, but you're not going to find it here. You're going to have to go out and do it on your own. So which I thought was a really, really cool connection. So I shared that. And then I saw the comment on that phenomenal midrash, which I had seen in the Talmud, which I know from the Talmud, about how the children of Israel grew and how the babies were born. And I thought that's really great background and coloring in, why the Haggadah is giving me suddenly talking about grass. And that's really interesting to me because it's giving depth to it, because otherwise, why is the Haggadah talking about grass in terms of numbers? There are lots of ways of making this point, and that all brought it back home to Rav Moshe Weinberger and saying, okay, maybe there's more symbolism to the grass, and it's not just about this one story of children growing from the ground or being reborn from the ground after their original birth, and then the threat, and then the salvation, and so on. So that was basically the journey, but it really started from this new Haggadah and the comment on the grass, and saying, okay, that would be fun to share. Let's now take 5 steps backwards, and maybe we'll learn something about the Haggadah at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
There's a biological explanation as well to grass, which is that it's extremely resilient and reappears every season in different forms and different shapes. It's a very good metaphor for resilience.
Absolutely. Yes, and also, I mean, there's something to say as well about just the geography of where so much of the relationship to grass and what it represents in terms of irrigation, and it can't be taken for granted. I think of a number of years ago, I think my brother from Israel was visiting, and we drove past Murray Hill Park in the summer, and just the green, just that intense field of green, and what that looks like to somebody who lives in the Middle East. It was quite dramatic, and the appreciation of that. So maybe there's something to apply here to a Haggadah, which is really addressing Eretz Yisrael and that reality, and what grass symbolizes in that climate. It's very different than our luscious yards.
I'm wondering about the apple trees that they gave birth under. Maybe that provided protection, and they couldn't plow because there's a huge apple tree. I don't know.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think that's a whole other class, and I jumped over that, but you're right to stop there and pause and say, what's an apple tree doing? Where do we come to an apple tree? Well, it could have been any tree. It could have been anything. What's that detail doing here? And that's a whole other class where apple trees are showing up in the strange
protection,
Yeah, and the Kabbalistic connotations of apple trees, the mysticism that's associated with apple orchards. There's a lot there. You're not noticing that for no reason. There is a lot there. Absolutely. Say ulamad, go and learn. There's a lot to talk about. Okay, take care, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shalom, thank you.
Shabbat shalom. Hakasher sameach too.